Hi there, I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Texas Tech Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and I'd like to welcome you once more to Institute Encounters, in which we have an opportunity to chat with various distinguished visitors we bring in to lecture on subjects pertaining to Western civilization. And today, our visitor is actually almost a neighbor by Texas standards.
Almost, just down the road.
Only about 120 miles away, perhaps, at West Texas A&M in Canyon, Texas, Dr. Bruce Brasington. Dr. Brasington is the Regent Professor of History and also Piper Professor of History at West Texas A&M. He's an authority on the Middle Ages, early and high Middle Ages, and has recently produced a book. It's a compendium of texts with commentary on the earliest, or the very early evolution of Western procedural law, called, I like the title, Order in the Court. So we're going to talk a little bit today. We're not going to try to tread on his lecture topic, but we're going to try to deal with some of those aspects, the darker aspects of the Middle Ages, the earlier part of the Middle Ages, that don't get as much attention as they should. This is really a period, say, from the 6th century through the beginnings of the 11th century, in which Europe is coming into being.
Indeed, absolutely.
Hardly exists in any sense we'd recognize it today. Before then, it's a bunch of provinces in the western part of the Roman Empire. But it begins to take on a lot of the kind of institutional and even national shape that we then see through the rest of its period. When did the term Dark Ages come into being?
Well, on the one hand, in fact, I just was talking to my students recently about this in my Western civilization class, that on the one hand, medieval people would have considered the world perfectly dark in any period because of sin. But it's a much later conception. I mean, you certainly see this in Petrarch in the Renaissance criticizing what had gone before, but it's not until the Enlightenment, the 18th century, when it really becomes a term that is so fixed. I mean, Luther in the Reformation is always talking about the darkness of scholasticism, so it's around 14th century and later, but it really gets fixed as a label, a term that gets slapped down on the past in the Enlightenment.
For a long time, it was used for almost the entirety of the period that we call Middle Ages. Sure. But it's sort of been relegated now to the first half.
In the period after World War I, where Charles Homer Haskins, one of America's earliest medievalists, did a book on the Renaissance of the 12th century, an attempt to rehabilitate the 12th century as not as a period of darkness but of light. And there have been various other medieval renaissances since then. So medievalists have been fighting back against the term as being an all-encompassing label. How successfully, that's hard to say sometimes.
Now, is there a big difference between post-12th century and pre-12th century, though post-Roman, Europe? And if so, how would you, what would be the best way to get a handle on that?
In every level of life, not just one thing. I mean, in terms of just people's everyday lives, the fact that you have a rapidly expanding population with new cities, with far greater commercial activity than earlier in the Middle Ages, just on the basic level of life, the world of, let's say, 1200 is profoundly different than the world of 1000 or even 1100. In terms of the sciences and culture, I mean, the appearance of the universities, the move from education being a monastic or a cathedral school to a university where one not only would receive a basic education but then training in law, medicine, or theology. I mean, that's clearly a profound difference from what we see earlier. So at every level, I mean, one can see a greatly different world, I think.
And people also sometimes now talk about that early period, say 6th through the 11th century, as at least part of it as sort of late antiquity, with the kind of various lingering aspects of the antique world. What remains antique about that early period of the Middle Ages?
Well, again, on a very basic level, tax collection. I mean, it's in terms of mechanisms of government, regardless of whether you're dealing with the late Roman administration or whether you're dealing with the early medieval Germanic kingdoms, they retained Roman practices of taxing and trying to administer the provinces as best they could. And of course, it depends on where you are in Europe. Just as any single label doesn't do justice to the diversity of any particular moment in time, the same thing is true is that it's not just Europe, it's Europe's. And southern Italy, under the orbit of Byzantium and Greek cultures, obviously profoundly different than, let's say, Ireland. So the further east and further south you go, the more there's going to be a persistence of the heritage of antiquity, and particularly from the Greek world.
So say you're in the kingdom of the Franks,
Sure.
which has, it varies. Its borders vary, but kind of roughly like France today. Was there, under the Merovingians, for example, was there a centralized, enough of a centralized bureaucracy to raise taxes in the way that the Romans had in Gaul?
Well, the kings certainly thought so and tried to collect the taxes, but the fact that we have endless disputes, I mean, the most important source for 6th century Francia is Gregory of Tours. In fact, I'm going to be citing him tonight in my talk. If we didn't have Gregory's history of the Franks, we would know the 6th century would be even darker. The fact that there are endless disputes between bishops and townspeople and tax collectors and noblemen indicates that the kings wanted their taxes, they didn't necessarily always get them. Centralized administration? No. There was no palace, there was no central place for government. But that didn't stop the kings from trying to get their money as best they could.
Who did they expect to levy their taxes if there wasn't a bureaucracy out there?
Well, they had counts who were expected to do it. There are people called scabini, who are local judges who are supposed to report to the king.
Were these appointed by the king?
Yes, but
not hereditary positions.
Not in theory, although often these positions become hereditary over time. But the most important person was your bishop, because your bishop had, and this was true. This was also true if we go centuries earlier. St. Augustine, for all his fame as a theologian, was a bishop of Hippo. In fact, letters of his that were discovered about 60 years ago, which was a remarkable find, previously unknown letters of his. What are those letters about? Not so much about theology, but about how do you deal with tax collectors. And so the bishop is somebody who is clearly not only involved in religious life, but he's also the interface between the people and the king.
So he, in this period, would be elected, wouldn't he, by the local clergy, with the people having some participation?
Yeah. In theory, there were three ways that a bishop could be elected. Either it could be, there could be a compromise. There could be divine inspiration. Saints' lives tell about doves landing on people's heads. But the most common thing was called per scrutinium, which means through scrutiny, where candidates would be evaluated and then there would be an election by the clergy and the people. That being said, obviously you have episcopal families, you have patronage, where over time certain individuals, certain families tend to produce these people.
Did the king have a say-so in these elections?
He certainly tried, and some bishoprics were far more royal than others. Again, I was talking about this with my students this morning at West Texas, that we can't, whether it's medieval, the Middle Ages, whether we're talking about ancient Rome or even today, we can't avoid the reality of the patron-client relationship. So obviously local families competed for power to get their people appointed.
So again, in 7th century France, we have a king, hereditary king. That's not true in every barbarian kingdom, but here it is. You have secular and religious officials, counts and bishops and other officials, who are at least ostensibly appointed, at least in the case of the secular ones, ostensibly appointed and some influence over the bishops. You have a king who wants them to collect taxes. Is he using them to support some sort of professional army?
No, the successful king, and of course the Merovingian dynasty, which is in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, more often than not, people spent time fighting one another rather than fighting outside the kingdom. The money was there above all as gift giving. It was not an administration in the sense that you're paying people to hold offices. The exchange of money, the moving of money around to keep people happy was clearly important. But salary, no. And there's tremendous resistance that, and this is true in any period of history, isn't it? Between what survives in the documents as to what's supposed to be collected and how the money is supposed to be spent and what actually happens.
So when he needs soldiers, where do they come from at this point?
He's supposed to call the army every spring.
And the army is made up of who?
The counts, the noblemen, and the retainers who come.
And the counts and the noblemen, they bring along their tenants who are armed. Is that...
It depends, because we don't have a system that has the sort of regularity that one would expect from, let's say, a feudal society later. And we don't necessarily know sometimes how many people were supposed to come. This creates a huge problem, because the most important person over time is not the king. It is the member of the Arnulfing family, one of the powerful families alongside the royal Merovingian family, who are the mayors of the palace. These are the ones who do the summoning of the army. They're the ones who actually have power, and so often they are the ones who make the decision as to what the army's going to do, not the king.
Now the army, but it's not a feudal army.
No.
I mean, you have a much larger free peasantry than you will
Depending on where you are
in France.
Right. Depending on where, but you also have slavery as well. That's the thing. It's so, and of course, and I have to be cautious because I'm not a specialist in early medieval social history, but the layers of society are much more complex than we think, because you have everything from slavery to half free to free tenants. Depending on where you are, this is true in England and elsewhere, you have people who own their own land, they hold their own land. A successful warrior like a Charlemagne is going to get the army to follow him. And that's the litmus test. If the ruler is powerful enough, the noblemen will show up, because if they don't, he will turn the army on them.
So it's not a professional army as would have been in the Roman days.
Precisely.
That's gone.
Right.
The king maybe has bodyguard, but apart from that, he's going to rely on the aristocracy and the freemen.
Right.
Which would include, I suppose, bishops. Are they supposed to turn out troops?
Well, I mean, yes, this is one of the great... in fact, I know people who work on this, that the church was not supposed to be involved directly in military affairs, but it was involved all the time. In fact, later in the Middle Ages, when you get to the 10th and 11th centuries, you even have cathedrals in Germany where you have prepositioned supplies for troops. Monasteries that have military attachments to them. So yes, effectively the bishop wears all these hats, and even if the bishop, and some bishops did go on the battlefield, even if they were not out there fighting, they were responsible.
Now, if we fast forward, say, to the High Middle Ages, and now we're in, say, somewhere in the 12th century.
Okay.
How has the situation change in terms of relationships between, let's stay in France here.
Okay.
How has the situation changed in the relationship between the king and his greater subjects and his lesser subjects? How does he think of himself in the point of view of fiscal matters nowadays? Is he still trying to raise taxes?
Yes.
Or is he relying on other things? What's the transition that has been made over half a millennium?
Unlike the kings of England, the Normans, who had the good fortune under William the Conqueror to conquer England and begin to oppose their system, the kings of France, the Capetian dynasty, which appears in the late 10th century, they were the Counts of Paris. They had to fight to make their royal power stick further and further and further away from Paris. And so this was a long period of fighting within France to get their overlordship as king recognized. And it takes centuries. What we see by the 12th century is a succession of energetic and successful French kings who are compelling their noblemen to actually obey them. And of course, France is much bigger than England, so getting the Duke of Aquitaine way down in southwestern France to send his required number of troops, make sure that people pay the taxes they're supposed to, takes a great deal of time.
You're still trying to raise money through taxes.
Sure.
And are you doing the same thing with it? Is still kind of gift giving, or is it, or there's now the beginnings of a kind of salaried bureaucracy?
There's the beginnings of a salaried. I mean, England and Sicily actually are the two places that are most effective at this. But you have an administration.
That's why William wanted to conquer it, wasn't it? Because it was
Precisely.
well organized business.
And not only taxes, like when we think of the exchequer in England. but also collecting fines. The king, like any government, is going to try to get money from any source it can find. But this is where the machinery, the at least rational in theory machinery of law and administration really begin in the 12th century, which is what I'm interested in, is how do you try to rationalize this system? How do you keep records? We have, from England, the pipe rolls, which survive from the early 12th century, and there's some missing rolls, but these are very long tubes which actually have the on parchment, the records of who owed what and did they pay. Doomsday Book, of course, after all, in England was, if nothing else, was a census to make sure that the king got his revenue. So it is coming to be into being in the 12th century. It is the creation of a bureaucracy.
So back in the 7th century, it would have been based on understandings, probably not written down, poorly recorded, if recorded at all.
There were charters, in other words, deeds of land, and then the dues that were expected. We have litigation that survives from church councils. Gregory of Tours, I mentioned earlier, talks about the king. The classic dispute is that a king demands more money than the town traditionally was supposed to pay. And then there's going to be all sorts of disputing back and forth over this. So there are records there, but they are far more scattered and certainly not organized. I mean, if you go way forward into the later Middle Ages, and I have friends who work on 13th, 14th, and 15th century, like the Crown of Aragon in Spain, they have hundreds of thousands of documents. I don't have to deal with that in the 12th century, fortunately, but that is the trajectory.
This is a reflection of more documents or better preservation, for the most part?
Well, I think probably both, truth be told, but that you now have functioning governments and infrastructure being paid for. And of course, the papacy, the papal records. I mean, the papacy leads the way in many respects in record keeping in terms of, if you want to look at the history of Western bureaucracy and law, you need look no further than Rome, really. But that is one of the ways the 12th century is sure profoundly different from earlier.
So earlier in the 7th century, the papacy really wasn't established as it was the senior kind of diocese of the West. He was Patriarch of the West, but he wasn't kind of regarded as the head of the Western Church in any kind of administrative way at that point, was he?
Well, it depends. Like on the one hand, I fully agree with you, because there's certainly not the sort of almost unchallenged recognition that one finds by the 12th and 13th centuries. I mean, by the time you get to the 12th century, I mean, you've got you've got any number. I mean, Papa Anemine Judicator, the Pope may be judged by no one. By the time you get to the 12th century, that's pretty clear. But it's an organic process. I mean, you can go all the way back to the early 4th century, and here I'm talking about law. And of course, there is a difference between de jure and de facto. I realize this, but already the Council of Sardica in the 340s says that if there's any dispute between two bishops that can't be resolved, send it to Rome. So as the highest appellate court of the church, as the place, the bishop with the greatest prestige, not necessarily absolute power, this is something that's already present very early on and gets more and more and more established over time.
Did that dictum apply to the Greek part of the church, or was that
the Papa?
Right.
They didn't go along with it. No, no, absolutely not. But it is, I mean, there is a very strong sense, even before the 12th century, of the degree to which the papacy is becoming imperial in the sense of a control at every level over the church. You see this in ritual, you see this in dress, and, the most famous or infamous example of this is the forged donation of Constantine from the 8th century. So, but it does become more and more established over time, and then with the bureaucracy to support the claims.
What about, how would you compare town life in the kind of Merovingian period, to the extent it existed, and in the High Middle Ages, 12th century France, say?
Imagine that you could go back in time and fly in an airplane over the Auvergne, west central France, to Tours in the 6th century. What you would see is forest, waste, and an occasional town. Towns surviving overwhelmingly from the Roman period. a place that was a civitas, a city, where you had a bishop, where you might have a count in residence.
Tours would be one of
Precise,
the
absolutely. But what you don't see, you may see occasional market center, but you don't see certainly don't see large cities. Now, south of the Alps, it's different. Obviously, Italy and Spain have a much more vibrant, much more abundant urban life. But it is very much an isolated world. By the time you get to the 12th
You don't see a lot of villages either, do you?
No.
Kind of scattering of
Right.
people.
Gregory, for example, in this History of the Franks, talks about the countryside was where the rustics, the rustici live. The pagani, the pagans, the people who live on the pagus, on the heath.
He's not suggesting they're literally pagans.
Well, who knows? Because the degree to which Christian doctrine was understood and practiced in a way that the church would recognize, it's clear it's not, because there's missionary activity going on all the time, and that continues for centuries. But by the time you get to the 12th century, you have vibrant cities. I mean, archaeologists have shown, for example, that the city of Rouen in Normandy, which I like to use in lectures as an example, expanded 9 different times. The city walls were changed 9 different times during the Middle Ages as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. We would still see the urban world of the 13th century, the 1200s, as small compared to our world. But it is vastly different. The overwhelming percentage of villages and small towns that exist in Europe today were founded after 1000.
And the towns also, in most cases, very quickly get a certain degree of self-government.
Yes, they do.
They demand charters. On what basis are they remembering sort of ancient models of self-governing towns in Rome, in Roman Empire? Or
it depends. If you're in Italy, certainly there are memories. I mean, in fact, you have Rome having a commune in the middle of the 12th century, reasserting its ancient sort of independence. But most of the towns are new. If they're new towns that are created, they're done by some sort of charter, whether it's from a count, whether it's from a king. Some of the most ambitious examples, in fact, are in England, where you have the kings like Edward I, who literally go out, second and third, who go out and create castles in Wales and then create planned communities there and give them a charter to attract people in. That remembering of the past may come later in the Middle Ages, when towns feel like they're being abused. They will remember that royal charter. But more often than not, these are pragmatic foundations by rulers who want revenue.
And they're trying to, they're assuming that their subjects have agency, and hence if you give them freedoms, they will come.
Right. And freedoms in a very, not only in a sense that we can think of as something that, some sort of privilege we have, but things that are also tremendously, liberty in the Middle Ages is also something that's very concrete. The liberty to do something, the liberty to control a particular property. And of course, citizenship meant a great deal. Being a burgher, being the member of a borough in a city, that was hugely important.
But they're hoping that this will attract people from elsewhere, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yes.
So that suggests that there's a certain degree in the High Middle Ages of mobility. People can, oftentimes we think of this as, people, serfs, bound to the soil.
Right.
But I mean, you couldn't get that kind of population wouldn't yield the migrants that you needed. So is that a kind of misconception of what things were like?
Again, it's not I wouldn't say it's a misconception at all, because again, it depends. I know I keep saying this. It depends on where you are and when you are. When you get into the 14th century and you've got overpopulation, famine, an awful economy, there's not a whole lot of social mobility. Earlier on, you're going to have, like for example, when the German emperors are moving steadily to the east, you're going to have people who are brought in. Now, the mechanisms of how these people are brought in, I don't know well enough. I don't know. But a lord who sees an opportunity to create a market town will certainly encourage craftsmen to move there and give them benefits in writing in a charter.
And self-governance as well.
Self-governance to a degree, and
they can elect the council or something of that kind.
And then of course, in places in northern France and certainly in northern Italy, when towns decide that they want even more self-governance and create a commune and begin to resist militarily their lords. I mean, places like Milan, for example, then they really do have a strong sense of self-governance. Now they're oligopolies, I mean, even if, it's not a completely democratic form of government, you have to be a member of a guild to be able to sit. Obviously, you have to be a man. You have to be a member of a guild to be able to vote. Powerful families, we think of the Medici, for example, in Florence, they are the ones who are very much calling the shots. But there is citizenship.
So if you look at a place like China, you don't see self-governing cities. You see very large cities,
Right.
but you don't see self-governing cities. So where are the Europeans kind of getting this conception of how to organize urban life?
There is a very strong sense. This is not very well thought out. The sense of title to place, if that makes some sense. That there was a sense of citizenship that goes all the way back into the Roman world, and even in the 6th century, even the early Middle Ages, people are still, and bishops are intensely proud of the fact that they come from a senatorial family and trace their lineages back centuries. I don't know if I can answer that correctly. I mean, it's interesting because I did a paper when I was doing my master's at SMU. I took a course in medieval Japanese history. Now, I don't read Japanese, but took this course, and since I wanted to study medieval studies, the professor said, well, why don't you do something that's comparative? And I looked at the planned towns under the kings of England in the 13th century in Wales, with towns that were planned in Japan during its reunification in the 16th and 17th centuries. And what I remember of this, and it's been a long time ago, is that you don't have that sense of self-governance in Japan. You might have certain rights and privileges, but you don't have that sense of self-governance. It remains under the shogun. Whereas, of course, in Europe, these people break free.
I remember reading about 8th century Rome. Mm-hmm. And in 8th century Rome, you can find documents in which they refer to the patrimony that's controlled by the city of Rome as the Republic of St. Peter.
Yes, famous book about that too.
So they were thinking now, of course, the Pope at this point is in fact the ruler, effectively, of the city. Mm-hmm. And he's still being elected with at least acclamation by the people. And if you go out, around Europe, you probably find other bishops who are in fact governing, in the early Middle Ages, governing their towns, their cathedral cities, and are also kind of elected in a similar way. So I wonder if that's a bridge.
I would agree with you, and of course it's just the fact of whether it's in the 8th century in Rome or whether it's up at Charlemagne's court at Aachen, when somebody uses the word res publica, republic, they are clearly classicizing, they are clearly evoking Rome. What exactly a res publica meant to somebody in the 8th century, who knows, because I'm certain that Cicero would have been appalled at what they thought a res publica was. But the fact that the word was still there, like freedom, libertas, freedom, that the word is there, and even if the meanings applied to it don't necessarily Magna Carta, originally it was a charter, right? But it becomes a very different kind of charter later on than what you had at Runnymede. That the word is there, and what people read into it, and also how they've remembered their history through it. So maybe that's it. Maybe that's just the fact that the word itself is there, and they get to Latin.
How does Charlemagne figure in all of this? He's sort of right in the middle between, say, the fall of the old Roman Empire and what we call the High Middle Ages. Right. Is that a turning point in Europe's development?
You could float this building, obviously, I think we all know this, on the amount of ink that's been spilled about Charlemagne. And the fact that his contemporaries and the people who came after him also saw him as an extraordinary person means that he's one of those people in history who really does live up to and exceeds the hype. A little side note before I get around to answering your question, there was a famous exhibit done in Aachen in the 1960s commemorating Charlemagne, which is a remarkable moment 20 years after the end of World War II, which is as much about Europe seeing itself reborn as remembering Charlemagne. So even in our modern world, a good 1,200 years after his time, we still look at him. It is a turning point in some respects that's absolutely profound. If you think of something as basic as the way we make our letters, the reform of script under the Carolingians is astonishing. In terms of a conception of a Christian Europe, which I'm going to talk about tonight, that somehow there is a need for governments to spread Christianity, to defend Christianity, and not just a kingdom. That's there. People see in Charlemagne's campaigns the antecedents of the Crusades. It's also, in a sense, in the failures that we see a turning point. Towards the end of his life, he issued a capitulary, a decree called De Celendis Litteris, on the cultivation of letters, where he was proposing something like a support for schools around his empire. Now, these were going to be schools to promote the education of young boys to be monks and priests. It was meant to be a religious education. But the idea that he was even thinking that is visionary. So I think, yeah, and of course to his contemporaries, the Roman Empire seemed to be reborn in him. Mm-hmm. And even if that was something that the Byzantine emperors no doubt disputed, in fact did dispute, and even if the insanity of the century that followed with Vikings and invasions put paid to the idea that somehow this Christian Europe was in fact reborn, he's still there. So yeah, he is transitional. He is a pivot point. There's no question.
So the rebirth of Christendom, of a sense of, now, the Romans obviously convert the empire to Christianity,
Right.
but I guess they continue to think of the world as a Roman world, which is now Christian, but it's primarily a Roman world.
Right.
Empire falls in the West. So then you have a series of kingdoms that eventually become Catholic.
Yes. Yeah.
They're not all at the beginning. And
Nominally, in many respects, but sure, but over time,
or
certainly.
they're Arian for a while, or something like that. But eventually they all become Catholic, say by the late 7th century, I think. They're all Catholic. But they don't think of themselves as a religious community at this point. How are they thinking of themselves?
We also have to remember who they are, because overwhelmingly our sources are coming from men in the church.
Yeah, right.
So they have that conception. The ideal is expressed by Alcuin of York, who was perhaps Charlemagne's closest advisor, when he talks about the Franks in the language of the Old Testament, that essentially just as God made his covenant with Israel, so now the Franks are God's people. He will refer to Charlemagne as a novus David, a new David, this strong sort of Old Testament sense of something that John Winthrop would have probably understood, the idea of a covenant, a relationship. But here we're not talking about all of the West, we're talking about the Franks in particular.
So it's a tribal notion of being a chosen people.
The Old Testament has, that's something that when you look at the early Middle Ages, for example, there's a type of text called a Fürstenspiegel in German, which is a princely mirror, how a ruler is supposed to govern. These are replete with references to the Old Testament. Be like Josiah, right? Learn from David's mistakes. So it's not European-wide, you're right. It is tribal. There is an ethnic, Frankish dimension to it. Agobard of Lyon, who was also an advisor, you talk about to Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, his son. One of the more remarkable and then also tragic texts that I remember from that period is he takes Paul's passage in Galatians, where Paul says, "In Christ there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female." One of the most startling statements of inclusivity as you could find, guaranteed to anger Jews, certainly anger pagans, and probably upset men quite a bit, that all are one in Christ Jesus. I don't remember all the passage, but he says, for example, in Christ there's now neither Frank nor Scythian. I wish I remembered all of it. But
so that marks a change.
Oh yeah, but sadly, the ideal is overwhelmed by the real, as history often is. But it is astonishing. It's no wonder that people talk about a Carolingian Renaissance.
So when Charles Martel is fighting against the invading Muslims at Chalon, he's fighting on behalf of the Franks. He's beating off Arabs and Berbers, and he's a Frank.
Right.
But when Charlemagne kind of fights against, when he goes into Spain or goes against the Saxons,
right,
he's a Christian king spreading. Is that the change in this course of generation?
At least in terms of the propaganda that's generated, that there is a mission. There is a missionary there's a missionary intent for this, that the Saxons continue to rebel, that they must be Christianized, they must be brought under control. And of course, there are no ifs, ands, or buts. So, but it's, yeah.
Are they in thinking of themselves now as Christians? Are they taking a lead from Islam? Islam is invading under the banner of the Prophet. Does that make them kind of? Is there a sort of dialectical process going on here?
No, I mean it. The whole ideology of the Crusade, which is obviously a fascinating and rich subject to study, is something that, again, kind of like the doctrine of the papacy, develops organically over time. I mean, already in the 8th century, no, 9th century, excuse me, Pope, if I remember correctly, Pope Nicholas I actually, in a letter, says that Christian warriors who die defending the faith, their sins are forgiven. But there's a long way from that to saying some sort of overarching ideology that one should go out there. The way you have when Pope Urban II preaches the First Crusade at Clermont, there's a whole, it's obviously developed far more by that time. Well, I hope that made sense.
In saying that if you die fighting for the faith, is that the first time that's said, as far as you know, in the Christian world? Die fighting for the faith, your sins are forgiven?
The first that I could remember, I'm sure that's still a small voice in my head just saying, Bruce, no, there are things earlier than that. I mean, to be a warrior, I mean, obviously the higher goal was to leave secular life, regardless of what you did to become a monk. Martin of Tours is a good example of that, earlier in the Middle Ages. But nowhere does Augustine in the City of God say that, soldier, leave your post. No, you're supposed to be in this world to fight. But the idea of getting a benefit, no. But I'm certainly willing.
Your sins are forgiven. The assumption is that's a kind of passport to heaven.
Right.
So that sounds like you're taking a leaf out of the Islamic book.
Yeah. Now, this is what I'm remembering in the 9th century. Now, whether in fact, I don't think there's any. I mean, there was, again, one would turn to the Old Testament though. Mm-hmm. The idea of, I mean, the Maccabees, for example, enormously influential on early medieval exegesis. And what better example of men who die for their faith, or fight for their faith, rather than the Maccabees?
But there isn't in Maccabees notion that those who died are going to go...
Fair enough. Well, there is that sort of a late notion of purgatory, but fighting and dying... Well, Christ himself, though. I mean, now other things are coming back to me. If you think of there's the early medieval Old High German poem, the Heiland, where Christ is portrayed as a warrior who is faithful. So this sort of...
When is that? When
I
is
want
that?
to say, is it 8th century?
No.
You have, I mean, this martial spirit in religion. That is, I mean, that's not the same thing as dying and getting your sins forgiven, but Christ is clearly, and being a Christian is clearly not the kind of pacifist that one would think of later. The Highland's fascinating, though, it really is.
What else does Charlemagne do? What's the rest of his legacy? Is there more?
Well, scholars have noticed that a favorite phrase that appears in his, now, could he write? Probably not. He could do his, according to Einhard, his biographer, he could read, and he would diligently practice trying to write. Well, even if he didn't write, and all he could do was sign his name, his seal, on a document. Clearly, those who sent out his messages, his missi dominici, his sent lords, his capitularies, his commands, were doing what he wanted. Scholars have noticed a phrase, the norma rectitudinus, the standard of correctness. So just as you were going to have one kind of script form, he wanted a copy of the Roman Missal. In other words, we will do the Mass, we will celebrate the Mass in our churches in the Frankish Empire the same way it's done in Rome. So we will copy that. There's a collection of church law, canon law, the Dionysius Hadriana. Charlemagne requested that a copy be sent from Rome up there so it could be copied. So there's a strong sense we want the things to be done correctly in worship and in law and in writing, and we want it done the Roman way. We want it to be standardized.
And he succeeds pretty much in getting hold of the political apparatus in his realm. I mean, he's appointing bishops and he's appointing counts, and they're really officials serving at his pleasure at this
There
point.
are disputes, and towards the end of his life, he rules for a very long time. He dies in 814. At the end of his life, there are some instances of some of his missi, some of his officials being attacked, which is an indication that his power is not as respected as it once was. Of course, before too long, when his son becomes emperor, Louis the Pious, eventually there's a civil war. His sons rise up against him. But effectively, Charlemagne does a very good job for most of his reign, making sure that church and state, if you can call it state, are going to do what he wants.
So after his death, there's a kind of descent into confusion, both internal and external, invasions from the outside, and the assumption of power at the local level increasingly.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, he does have a legacy that endures, and it must be a sort of intangible legacy in a way. What is that?
Again, in a world that is so consumed with ritual and symbol, it's probably the best to go to answer that, or try to answer that through those means. We understand the nature of transpersonal rule, that President Trump does not own the United States. President Obama did not own the United States. President Trump could not sell California in order to raise money for the United States. In the early Middle Ages, it was part of, land was partable. That's why Charlemagne's empire was split into three different, under Louis the Pious, was split into three different kingdoms. That's why they fought. But the memory of the empire remained. Even if it were split up, the empire was still in the hands of one of his grandsons. So when Otto the Great goes to Aachen in the 960s and gets himself crowned emperor at Aachen, which of course was Charlemagne's capital, he's sending a message. Whatever has happened to the actual empire, it's never died out, and I'm reclaiming it. Does that sort of answer your question or not?
Well, in part, does Charlemagne change the way in which? Are you suggesting, for example, that under the Merovingians, it would have been thought that the king owned all land and just sort of gave it temporarily to whoever was farming it? Is that changed under Charlemagne? Is there a greater sense of a division between the political and the personal?
I would say so. And there's certain key moments in Western history where you see that developing notion of nation. If I could leave Charlemagne for a moment, when you think back to when Henry I of England in 1100 gives his coronation oath, he's making a statement about the king and kingdom, not as the kingdom as some sort of property or something he can dispose of. So there's certain moments in medieval legal and institutional political history where you can say, yeah, things do change there.
And this is a recovery of the Roman notion that there's a difference between politics and person.
And then it becomes endlessly debated. In one of my courses right now, the Roman history course, I've just talked about Vespasian. And Vespasian, there was the lex, the law, that said that the Senate and the people had conferred authority and power to him. Well, what exactly did that mean? Well, to later rulers, particularly after the 12th century when the Roman law is studied again, well, that conveyance is obviously the translatio imperii, the handing over of the empire. So this is why the ruler's in charge. Others are going to begin to argue, well, if the people and the Senate and the people handed it over, presumably they could take it back. So these surface over time. They become hooks on which all sorts of debates are hung. But yeah, certainly with Charlemagne, we do see a change. No question about it.
What would you say as a scholar, mainly of the High Middle Ages?
Okay.
Right? What are the kind of most interesting research priorities and projects underway in your field?
Well, if I speak more specifically now about my work in medieval law, every once in a while a student of mine will come to me and say, Dr. Brasington, why on earth do you study this? And I ask myself that question sometimes myself. I do, why I do this. One of the standard answers I give is I pull out a ring binder that it lists manuscripts, medieval manuscripts and various texts that deal with ecclesiastical law. And I take about this much out of a very large ring binder and I say, we know this much. For me, what is exhilarating is that so much is out there in manuscript form that has either never been studied or only studied a bit. So, and there are other fields as well, medieval science, where so much is still in manuscript form. So the ability to find new things, new ideas, new texts, encounter new people, manuscripts that come to light of texts that we thought we knew. Whenever I find a glossed manuscript where somebody from Roman or canon law has then written notes in the margin where I get a sense of how that person was reading or engaging the text, that is what I find incredibly compelling, because it's fresh, it's new, and it sheds light on our tradition.
Where do you find all these unread manuscripts?
I wish I could say that they were all digitized, and some people think they are, but no. The kind of manuscripts I work on, grotty legal manuscripts, are going to be about the last ones. They're going to be online because they're not pretty. Granted, there are more that are available in digital form, but no, you got to go to Europe. There are some collections here in the United States, but overwhelmingly you have to go either to the great national collections like the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, the Vatican Library in Rome, to municipal libraries, cathedral libraries. And of course, sadly, with the passage of time over the centuries, both from natural disasters and human disasters, lots has been lost. But there's still things out there to find. But you got to go to them, because they're not going to come. They're not going to come to Lubbock, and they're not going to come to Canyon either. You've got to go there.
So the medieval period is not dead and buried. It's a frontier just being explored.
It is, and there are subjects that have been studied and restudied. But even when we know all the manuscripts of Doomsday Book, right? There's still new ways to interpret them, new techniques, new insights. But in some fields, like science, like law, the field that I work on, there are new things. I will tell you, for example, I did my dissertation research in Munich. So Darlene and I, my wife and I, were in Munich. I had a fellowship. So I was at an institute for medieval studies in Munich in the 1980s, back during the Cold War. Well, there's no way in the world I could go into East Germany and look at manuscripts. And if you tried to order microfilms, they didn't have the microfilm readers necessarily to make copies. In the early 1990s, when the wall came down, I had a chance for the first time to go work in Dresden and in Leipzig. Leipzig in particular has great resources. To go in there and see manuscripts, and what you do is you sign a little form indicating you've looked at it, that the last time somebody had looked at that manuscript was 1930. So there are all sorts of wonderful reasons, far more so than medieval studies, for the collapse of communism. But the fact that things have come to light, there are new things to study, and that's what's exciting. History isn't just going over the same old facts over and over again.
It doesn't stay the way it was.
No, it doesn't.
Discover what you increasingly uncover it, bit by bit, yard by yard.
Absolutely, there's always something new.
Well, you've certainly conveyed your enthusiasm.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm sure the specialists in the early Middle Ages are going to go, "Oh well, Bruce, you should have talked about that," or "You've got that point wrong." But I'm so thankful to be able to have studied medieval history and to be a medieval historian. And in terms of what the Institute does, this is, I mean, obviously not a dark age, but a vital part of our great heritage, and one worth considering and learning from and understanding in our world today.
Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing all that knowledge with us.
Thank you.